My name is Trevor, I'm 37 years old, and I live in a small town called Pineville, in the state of Illinois. I've always been the type of person who loves looking for interesting items at garage sales. I think it's the thrill of discovery, finding something unique, something unexpected, something with a history. That's how last weekend I found the music box that changed everything. It was a Saturday morning, and I was strolling through one of those garage sales in the neighborhood. The sale was at an old house, and honestly, it looked like one of those typical sales with worn furniture and used toys. I wasn't expecting to find anything special until I saw the music box. It was on top of a table, almost hidden among piles of old stuff. It seemed a little out of place, much more cared for than the rest of the items. It had wooden details and a soft painting. The lady running the sale, a woman with white hair and a somewhat strange expression, told me that the box belonged to her grandmother. She said it had been in the family for a long time, but for some reason she was getting rid of almost everything. I had a strange feeling that she was watching me in a slightly insistent way, as if I were doing something wrong by buying the box. I didn't think too much about it and ended up buying it. I paid almost nothing, which made her smile, but in a forced way, almost. I got home late in the afternoon and, as always, started to fiddle with the things I bought. The box was in good shape, but for some reason it felt heavier than it looked. I placed it on the kitchen table and turned the key to see how it worked. I twisted the key on the side of the box, but when I started turning it, I noticed it wasn't making the usual sound that a music box would make. I was confused, so I let it go and decided to do something else. That night I stayed up later than usual. The house was quiet, except for the clock ticking in the living room. Everything seemed calm. However, in the middle of the night, I woke up to a melody, very soft yet eerie. At first, I thought it was a dream, but then I realized the sound was coming from somewhere in the house. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. I got out of bed, the sound growing clearer. I went to the kitchen, where the music box was sitting on the table. When I got there, the melody stopped abruptly. The box was intact, with no explanation for the sound. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to understand what had just happened. There was no one in the house but me, and the box was quiet. But I was sure I had heard the music. It gave me chills. I tried to ignore it, went back to my room and tried to sleep. But with each passing minute, I felt an increasing sense that something was wrong. The feeling of being watched became unbearable. And then, in the middle of the night, the melody came back. Now louder and clearer, almost as if the box had taken it upon itself to play on its own. The music was strange, not a normal tune. It felt like something from an old tale with a dark, drawn-out tone, something that didn't belong. I got up again, now with my heart racing. I went to the kitchen once more. The box was there, sitting quietly. I swear, there was no one playing it, and there was no visible key to suggest it had been wound manually. Something was wrong, and I felt like the box was challenging me in some way. I decided to pick up the box and check it, so I grabbed it in my hands. It felt even heavier now, as if it had accumulated some kind of invisible energy. I looked at the bottom of the box, where I found something I hadn't noticed before. There was an inscription, almost faded, as if someone had carved it, but the ink was starting to fade. The inscription said something like, "Do not touch after midnight." At that moment, I didn't understand what it meant, but something deep inside me knew it wasn't a coincidence. I dropped the music box immediately. It fell with a slight thud on the floor, but the sound of the melody didn't stop. I went to the living room, sat on the couch and just sat there, staring at the box, which now seemed to be moving, as if it was stirring with something invisible. The music kept playing for a while longer. I didn't know what to do. I just wanted it to stop. But it didn't. The melody got louder and more intense, and then, at the peak of the music, it stopped suddenly, as if it had been cut off. The silence in the house was absolute. The fear I felt at that moment was indescribable, a feeling I can't even properly explain. It was like the air around me was thick, too dense to breathe. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening to every sound and trying to understand what was happening. When the day finally dawned, the music box was quiet, as if it had never played. I don't know what that was. I've never been able to explain it. The next day, I decided to get rid of the box. I went to the back of my yard and buried it, hoping that everything would end there. But the truth is, to this day, I can't get that sound out of my head. That melody that played that night still echoes in my mind, and whenever I'm in silence, I swear I hear it again, even after all this time. I don't know what really happened that night, and I may never know. But the feeling of being watched, that never went away. My name is Brian, I'm 37 years old, and I live in Knoxville, Tennessee. I'm going to tell a story that happened with my family a few years ago, but to this day I still don't know exactly what happened. Back then, everything seemed so simple, but looking back now, I feel like something was seriously wrong. And it still scares me to this day. It all started on a weekend when my wife, Carla, and I decided to check out a garage sale happening at a neighbor's house. I didn't expect to find anything interesting, but for some reason I decided to tag along. Carla, on the other hand, was excited to browse through the items. She always loved looking for old and unusual things. That's when I saw her. An old doll, dressed in simple fabric clothes, but with a curious, almost unsettling expression. She was sitting there, forgotten in a box of toys. Her face was made of porcelain, and although it was a bit worn out, her eyes seemed almost alive. I don't know why, but something about that doll made me want to buy it. Carla thought it was just an old doll, and honestly, I thought the same. I bought it for a few bucks and brought it home. The first few days, the doll stayed in the guest room. Nothing out of the ordinary happened. But on the third day, I noticed something strange. The doll wasn't where I left it. I had placed it on a shelf, but it wasn't there. I went into the guest room, searched everywhere, and eventually found it in the living room, sitting on the couch. I didn't remember moving it, but I thought maybe I was just imagining things. Carla didn't think much of it, and figured it was some kind of joke. So I put the doll back on the shelf in the guest room, locking the door because the thought of it moving started to make me uneasy. The next morning, the doll was back on the couch, staring at me. That was the beginning of a series of events that I honestly can't explain to this day. Over the next few days, things got worse. I began to notice the doll appearing in different places, even when I was sure I had put it away in a locked cabinet. No matter how many times I closed the door and locked it, the doll always found a way to get out. One time, I found it in the hallway, its eyes fixed on my bedroom, as if it was watching me while I slept. I, being skeptical, tried to ignore it. Maybe it was some trick of my mind, or maybe I was just forgetting where I placed the doll. But as the days went by, things began to intensify. Sometimes I'd find it outside the cabinet, even with the door locked. Other times it would be on the dining table, even after I had placed it back in the guest room. This started to make me nervous. I'm not the type of person who believes in ghosts or anything like that, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. One night, after finding the doll in a place I had clearly locked, I made a decision. I didn't want to see that doll anymore. I decided to lock it away in a trunk, and just to be sure, I put the trunk in a corner of the basement. I turned on the light and made sure no one would have access to that room, not even Carla. However, things only got worse. A few days later, I went down to the basement, and when I opened the trunk, the doll was there. Not only was it out of the trunk, but it was sitting in an old chair that was in the room, facing the stairs, as if it was waiting for someone to come up. I almost froze in fear. My mind couldn't find a logical explanation anymore. There was no one in the house except for me and Carla, and she had promised me she wasn't touching the doll. That night, the tension was unbearable. I tried talking to Carla, asking her to help me figure out what was going on, but she couldn't see what I was seeing. She told me I was getting paranoid and suggested that I just get rid of the doll, since it was making me so uncomfortable. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. I decided to take the final step and get rid of the doll for good. The next morning, I grabbed the doll, put it in a plastic bag, and took it to a park far away. I left it there, far from our house, thinking that I would finally be free of that nightmare. But the next morning, it was back. The doll was on the dining table, exactly where I had left it before I got rid of it. The cold chill down my spine was so intense that I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was happening. I couldn't explain how or why it kept coming back, but one thing was clear. It was there to stay. Today, years later, I've never seen the doll again. I really hope it was taken or that it somehow disappeared. But the feeling that something was watching me never went away. Sometimes at night, I feel like it's still there somewhere waiting for me. My name is Miles. I'm 38 years old. I live in Tacoma, Washington, and I'm going to tell you something that happened to me about 5 years ago. It's hard to find an explanation for what I saw, but whenever I think about it, I get chills running down my spine. I hope sharing this somehow helps, even if it's just to get this weight off my chest. It all started on a regular Saturday. I was out for a stroll and happened to pass by a garage sale in the neighborhood. It's the kind of thing you see often around here. Old furniture, dusty boxes of books, broken toys. Nothing too interesting. But then, in the middle of all that, my eyes stopped on a mirror. It was big, with a dark wooden frame full of intricate carvings, somewhere between Baroque and Gothic. It looked pretty old. I don't know why, but I felt an instant attraction to it. Maybe it was the price, just $10, or maybe something else. The sale owner, an elderly man with grey hair, seemed relieved when I said I wanted to buy the mirror. He didn't try to negotiate, just shook his head and said, "Take it, please." It felt odd at the time, but I didn't think much of it. I carried the mirror to my car and took it home, planning to place it in the hallway near the entrance. It was the perfect spot. The mirror reflected the hallway light, and the frame really gave the place a vintage touch. That night, as I was adjusting the mirror on the wall, I noticed something strange. When I stepped back to look at the result, I felt that something in the reflection wasn't right. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. It seemed like the light reflected in the glass was a little darker than it should have been, as if the mirror was absorbing some of it. I shrugged it off and thought it was just my imagination. In the following days, I started noticing more odd things, small but unsettling. For example, every time I passed by the mirror, I had the feeling that something else was reflected in it. I'd look, and everything seemed normal, but I'd get this strange feeling, like my eyes hadn't seen everything. One night, while sitting on the couch watching TV, I noticed that I could see the mirror in the corner of my eye. I swear I saw movement, as if someone had walked past it. But when I looked directly at it, nothing was there. I tried convincing myself that I was just tired, that it was all in my head. But then things started to get really unsettling. About a week later, it was late, almost midnight, and I was heading to bed. I passed by the mirror, and without thinking much, I took a quick glance. That's when I saw it. In the reflection, there was something behind me, like a shadow, but it wasn't a shadow. It was the figure of a person, tall and thin, standing in the hallway. My heart raced. I turned around immediately, but there was no one there. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But after that, I started avoiding the mirror. I even thought about covering it with a cloth, but for some reason, something inside me resisted the idea. It was as if the mirror wanted me to look at it. That might sound crazy, but it's the only way I can describe it. A few days later, a friend of mine, Claire, came over to visit. When she entered the hallway, I noticed she stopped right in front of the mirror and stared at the reflection for a while. "What a strange mirror," she said. I asked what she meant, and she replied, "I don't know. It's like the reflection isn't right." My stomach sank. It wasn't just me noticing things. The turning point, or the worst part, happened about a month after I bought the mirror. It was a quiet night, and I was home alone. I was reading in the living room when I heard a scraping sound coming from the hallway. I got up slowly, my heart pounding harder. When I got closer, I saw that the mirror looked different. The glass seemed darker, almost opaque. I gathered my courage and approached it, staring directly at the reflection. And there it was again, that tall, thin figure. But this time it was closer, almost pressed up against the glass, as if trying to pass through. I was paralyzed. Whatever it was, it had eyes. Not normal eyes, they were black holes, lifeless, but somehow full of intent. Suddenly I felt a cold breeze blow through the hallway, as if all the windows had been opened at once, but they were all closed. At that moment, I heard a low sound like a whisper coming from the mirror. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it was almost as if it were calling me. I ran. I grabbed a towel, threw it over the mirror, and dragged it to the garage. I couldn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, trying to decide what to do. The next day, I took the mirror to a junkyard and left it there. The guy working there didn't ask any questions. He seemed happy to take anything. Since then, I've never seen anything like it again, but I still wonder. What was that thing? What did I see in that mirror? And more importantly, is that thing still out there on the other side, waiting for someone to look again? I don't know, and to be honest, I'd rather not find out. My name is George. I'm 42 years old, and I live in a small town called Cumberland in the state of Maryland. I've always been one to buy things second-hand, mainly because I believe that old items hold some kind of history. A few months ago, I came across an old rocking chair at a garage sale. It was sturdy, made of solid wood, and had that vintage look that just caught my attention. The elderly woman who was selling it said it belonged to her grandmother, and she had no use for it anymore. I paid $20 for it, thinking it would be a nice addition to my living room. But little did I know, that chair would change everything. At first, it seemed like any other piece of furniture. I placed it in the corner of the living room, next to the window where the afternoon sun filtered through. I even sat in it a few times, enjoying the creak of the wood beneath me. But one night, everything changed. I was sitting on the couch, watching TV, when I heard a faint creaking sound coming from the chair. I thought it was just the chair settling, so I ignored it and kept watching my show. But the sound didn't stop. It was as if someone was gently rocking in that chair back and forth. I froze. There was no one there, just the chair, rocking all on its own. I turned off the TV and stood up, walking slowly toward the chair. As I got closer, the creaking stopped. I sat down, thinking it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I sat there, the air grew colder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It felt like someone was watching me. I quickly got up and turned on the lights, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I shook it off, thinking I was just tired, and went to bed. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the faint sound of creaking wood. It was distant at first, but then it got louder. By the time I reached the living room, the chair was rocking again, slowly, back and forth, but there was no one sitting in it. The next few days were a blur. The creaking continued, every single night. I couldn't understand it. I tried to research the chair to find out if it was just an old piece of furniture that had a tendency to make strange noises, but no matter what I found, nothing explained the sensation of someone unseen sitting in it. It was as if the chair had a mind of its own. I even asked a few friends to come over, thinking that maybe I was just imagining things. But when they sat in the living room, the same thing happened. They didn't hear the creaking at first, but as soon as they left, the chair started rocking again. One night, I decided to confront whatever was in that chair. I waited until everyone was asleep and sat in the chair myself, hoping to understand why it was doing this. As I sat there, the creaking began again. But this time it was louder, and I could feel a presence beside me. It wasn't a warm, comforting feeling. It was cold, dark, and suffocating. I tried to get up, but something seemed to hold me in place. My heart raced, and I could feel my breath quicken as I realized I wasn't alone. I heard a voice, faint but clear, whispering my name. George. My blood ran cold. I knew I had to leave, but I couldn't move. The whispers grew louder, the chair rocking more violently. I struggled to stand, but something invisible was pushing me back down. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I broke free, rushing out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I didn't go back into the living room that night, or the night after. I couldn't. I had to get rid of the chair. I called a local antique dealer, hoping he could take it off my hands. But when he came to pick it up, he refused. He said the chair had a history, a dark one, and it had no place in anyone's home. I didn't know what to do. I tried to burn the chair, thinking that might put an end to it. But when I set it on fire, the flames didn't spread. It was as if the chair was immune to the fire, just standing there untouched. I tried everything. I even contacted a paranormal investigator, hoping they could give me answers. They said that the chair was likely cursed, haunted by something malevolent. They advised me to get rid of it, to bury it far away. But no matter what I did, the chair always found its way back. To this day, the creaking continues every night. I don't know what's in that chair, or why it won't leave me alone, but I can't seem to escape it. The chair has become a part of my life, a constant reminder that some things are better left in the past. I don't know who or what is sitting in it every night, but I can feel its presence. It's not just the chair, it's something else, something I can't explain. And as much as I try to ignore it, I know deep down that it's not over yet.